I want to sort of bring us to one more theme that is there in your work, and sort of a more modern theme of econophysics, before we go into your latest book and other questions I want to ask, because that's another theme which is more recent, probably the last 10, 15 years. Could you tell us a little bit about your interest in that area?
Yes. Again, you see, my procedure in all these things is to say, if I find a pattern or I'm being told a stylized fact, I take it apart to find out how it works and try to put it back together. In the process, I discovered that there's a theoretical foundation to it. Mm-hmm. So I began quite accidentally in this issue. I was working on the idea of constructing an index, constructing a measure of the income of the bottom 80% of the population. I call that the vast majority. I worked with a graduate student, now a professor named Amar Ragab, originally from Egypt. And we showed we could estimate this number for every country for which the World Bank has data. And we could calculate it. And then, of course, the logical thing is to compare it to the average GDP to see the sense in which the GDP per capita of the whole is biased relative to the per capita income of the bottom 80 or bottom 70 or whatever. We tried that, 90. And in the process, we discovered something that was very startling. We compared the two also to the Gini coefficient, and we discovered a rule which happened to hold for every single country of the world. And that rule was so simple and astonishing that I was sure that we'd made a mistake. We did it again. Excuse me. And the rule is the following. The income per capita of, let's say, the bottom 80% divided by average GDP per capita is always equal to 1 minus the Gini coefficient and a particular constant, a number, which depends on whether we're taking 80% or 90% or 70%. So if I look at 70% GDP per capita, income per capita over GDP per capita, then that number is 1. That ratio is equal to 1 minus G. If I look at 80%, that same ratio, 80% over average, is equal to 1.1 times 1 minus G. If I look at 90%, it's 1.25. But that's true of Botswana and Norway and every single country in between. So when we plotted this, I was astonished because it didn't seem feasible. I cannot imagine. And that led me to investigate the literature about income inequality. I ran across a group of physicists, Viktor Yakovenko and his co-workers, who in a different way had tried to explain income inequality within a country. And they came up with a explanation using physics, thermal, superthermal, and I realized that that same explanation implied these ratios. When I worked through the math of it, I discovered that their theory implied that the GDP per capita of the bottom 80% over the average was equal to 1.1 times 1 minus G. And I thought, wow. Since we had already discovered this, and the other numbers also fit, we show that. And so I wrote a paper about that. I can proudly say that paper has been rejected by every single journal that I have sent it to because it does not base itself on what inequality measures usually do, a social welfare function, some utility theory, I don't use any of that. I nonetheless continue to work in that direction. So recently I showed that I can explain Piketty's movement in the post-war period, the movement of inequality using the same econophysics principles. And here I'm focused on the United States. And that helps me understand why inequality rose. And I show that it rose because of two factors alone. One is the shift from wages to profits. The profit-wage ratio rose sharply, and that meant that inequality, which is the income coming from the top, becomes greater. And the other is the recirculation of incomes through financialization. And that it means that more and more people are getting property income. The ratio of property income to workers' income, wage and salary income, turns out to be the crucial measure to explain the Gini coefficient. And so I come back again to the same principle, which is good from my point of view because I'm coming from a theoretical framework where the fundamental variable, so to speak, is the ratio of profits to wages or the ratio of profit to capital. And then this degree of financialization ties back to the earlier work on productive and unproductive activities and the fact that finance recirculates things and doesn't create new wealth. So now I can explain not only the various income shares and the Gini coefficient in all the countries of the world, but I can also answer Piketty's claim that this is somehow natural, because I can show that the ratio of profit to income changed because of a concerted attack by Reagan and the Reagan neoliberal coalition on labor, which lowered wages relative to productivity, raised the profit share, and by the loosening of restrictions on financial activities, which led to this tremendous buildup of a pyramid of derivatives on top of derivatives. Those two things alone. Then Piketty says that this is a return to the natural state, so to speak, of capitalism, and I don't think so. I don't see that workers' wages are going to go back to the 18th century, even though the share has shifted, and I don't see that financial deregulation is an eternal characteristic. I see politically, and this brings back to the earlier discussion of the 60s, I believe that things can be changed, and therefore I don't see any reason why finance capital cannot be at least partially put back into the bottle from which it was unleashed.